In this second video on Lost Buildings of Newcastle, we'll be looking back at some of Newcastle's lost jewels. These lost buildings include Rowton House, the original Victorian City Library, the former YMCA Building near Gray's Monument, Kemsley House at the bottom of Westgate Road, and finally Newcastle Jail, which stood at Carliol Square. Aside from the jail, most of the historic buildings in this video were lost in the 1960s and 70s, mainly victims of Newcastle city centre redevelopment, and in the case of Rowton House, a fatal fire. In 1892 in London, a new type of accommodation appeared, a so-called Rowton House created by philanthropist Lord Rowton to provide cleaner, better and affordable places to live. The first one opened in Vauxhall, London, but a company was formed to expand the scheme. In 1904, the announcement that a new Rowton House was to be built in Newcastle was made by a meeting presided over by Lord Armstrong. It would provide accommodation for 240 male lodgers, and the architect was J.C. Maxwell. The house had 4 floors, each with 60 cubicles, separated by wooden partitions. The building opened in 1906, and the manager was to be Colonel Sergeant S. O'Brien of the Northumberland Fusiliers. At the time, it was described as a poor man's hotel, yet still considered architecturally a great improvement on the previous dilapidated and ancient neighborhood of Dog Bank and Lower Pilgrim Street. The building was a red brick structure whose great height overshadowed the humbler dwellings surrounding it. On entering, the boarder would go to the office, books his cubicle, and is given a locker to store his work tools. There was even a library in the west wing, furnished in solid oak. Above the lower floors was a balcony that was 115 feet long and 12 foot wide. A porter slept on each floor and had control of the electric light switches from his hall. By 1919, the building had been reopened as the Working Men's Palace and was being ran by the Salvation Army after having extensive alterations costing £20,000. This working men's utopia came to an abrupt end in 1967 when a fire started in the building, which gutted the upper floors. 4 men died, including 2 staff members. 1 man suffered serious burns, and 11 others were injured. The men lodging in the hostel were decamped to the disused nearby Jubilee School, most of them losing their worldly possessions in the fire. By the mid-1970s, the Men's Palace had been demolished and replaced by the current building on City Road. The new building is Grade 2 listed, and its closure was announced in 2014. It currently stands empty. The former Newcastle City Library stood on what is now John Dobson Street, next door to the Laying Art Gallery on Newbridge Street and on the former site of Carliol Tower. The foundation stone to the City Library was laid in 1880. It was built in classical style, designed by A. Fowler at a cost of £20,000. In 1882, on its opening day, 2,200 people visited, loaning over 2,000 books. The building had 3 stories as well as a basement. It had apartments for book repair, a lending library, reference library, a sculpture room, and art galleries with gas skylights formed in a semicircular, panelled roof. When the City Library was opened, it had over 18,000 books. Some had been bought, some had come from the Mechanics' Institute. The library system of 1882 was quite different from today. Books were arranged according to their size on the shelves, in order that they appeared more uniform and took up less space. The old Victorian library was demolished in the 1960s to make way for John Dobson Street, and a new library was built slightly to the west of the original building in typical 1960s concrete brutalist style. This new library was finished in 1968 and was designed by architect Sir Basil Spence. One member of the public at the time said it was
barbarism to replace good solid buildings of distinction and character with blocks of glass and concrete. Once the familiar places have gone, nothing can be put back again. Newcastle think again.
The second library only lasted until 2007 due to its deterioration, and the third and current library was designed by architects Ryder and built at a cost of £23 million using the same foundations as the second. The third library was aesthetically an improvement on the second, but the loss of the first beautiful Victorian library can never be undone. The YMCA Building stood near Gray's Monument on the corner of Blackett and Granger Street. The foundation stones of this building were laid in 1896 after the YMCA bought St James's Chapel, which stood on the land, but later demolished the chapel in order to erect a purpose-built accommodation for the YMCA. The YMCA building was designed by J.W. Taylor and cost £50,000 to build. The finished building tapered towards the front and had an imposing exterior with a tower. The building was opened in 1900 by Queen Victoria's son Arthur, Duke of Connaught, and his wife Louise. At the time of its building, it was said,
"The structure is so situated to rank with the most prominent in the city."
St James's Chapel itself was built partly on the site of Ficket Tower in 1826 and was designed by John Dobson. When built, the YMCA building also provided accommodation on the first floor for the Blackett Street Post Office and Monument Cafe. The building's interior included Connaught Hall, which seated hundreds of people, a reception room, reading room, a library, a gym, and baths. By the 1970s, the building was scheduled for demolition to make way for the new Eldon Square development. Another jewel of Tyneside architecture lost in the name of development and progression. At the bottom of Westgate Road, opposite Stevenson's monument, used to stand a fine Victorian-era building latterly called Kemsley House. In its later years, the building was home to the Evening Chronicle offices before they moved to the Grote Market. This building was another victim of 1960s city redevelopment alongside the Norwich Union Building next door. Kemsley House was vacated and demolished in the mid-1960s. It was replaced by Westgate House, which was incongruous and unsympathetic to its surroundings, which was demolished itself by 2006. The modern building houses student accommodation and is more sympathetic to its surroundings, but can never replace the lost beauty of Kemsley House. The Newcastle Jail stood on what is now Carliol Square and the Telephone Exchange building. As can be seen from the modern-day view, this jail occupied a large space and is sometimes little known about by the locals. Newcastle Jail's foundation stones were laid in 1823 by Robert Bell, along with some symbolic coins. It was designed by John Dobson and incorporated a formidable gate and door, 25-foot-high walls, a central tower, and 90 cells laid out in a radio wing design. However, Dobson only wanted to use the best materials, meaning the building's final cost was £50,000, a huge amount at the time, and not all of the cells could then afford to be built, meaning the jail was subsequently constantly overcrowded. The Carliol Square jail was actually not the first jail in Newcastle, and prior to it being built, prisoners were held from 1399 in Newgate Prison, which was one of the gates of the medieval city walls, approximately on the site of the current Next on Newgate Street. However, Newgate Prison was considered inconvenient and insecure, and a new city jail was needed. At the time, Carlisle Croft was one of the only locations in the city that was still undeveloped, and this location was chosen as the site in 1823 of the new jail. However, not long after opening, the jail was already being described as damp, cramped, insecure, and cold. Prisoners in Newcastle Jail would be expected to do tedious manual labor and sometimes hard labor such as stone breaking from within the walls of the jail. Stones were sometimes thrown over the walls by the prisoners to signal to those on the outside that the prisoner was ready to receive an incoming package back over the wall. Executions of prisoners were also carried out within the walls of the jail, the bodies being buried inside the jail. The last man executed on the site was Ambrose Quinn, a corporal in the RAF, in 1919 by a 7-foot drop from the gallows. The jail was demolished in 1925 as part of a Home Office efficiency drive, and the prisoners were moved elsewhere. Some of the stone from the jail was used to face the walls on the Gateshead side of the Tyne Bridge. Before construction of the current building seen today could commence, the bodies of the executed prisoners had to be found and disinterred. However, only 12 of the 15 could be found, which were moved to Jesmond Cemetery. It's possible the other 3 bodies still lie buried under Telephone Exchange Building to this day. The Telephone Exchange is no longer in use as its original purpose, and its current use is a mix of retail, office, and student housing.